Hello, hello. All right. You know what I realized yesterday? I realized that I was speaking too close to the mic, so there's a bunch of bad popping sounds. We'll get a better mic eventually, but that's probably perfect right there. I was speaking a little bit too close yesterday, but it's okay. We'll figure this out. The first week is practice. There we go. Let's get our angles right. There we go. Our angles. Pull this forward a little bit. Okay. Today we're only going to do one. We'll catch up. I'll do some more by the weekend to catch up. What day are we on? We are exactly almost a week before. This is Friday. We're going to do Friday, October 29th. And then within the weekend, I'll catch up this week. And then by next Monday, we should be on Monday. And right now it's 6:20. So if I wake up 5 to 6, do a couple hours because it takes about 3 hours to prepare these, to take the New York Times and to summarize it down to like 20% of the content and to put it in the Google Doc that I link. So that way we're all on the same page. Because when we make this argument, we want to be able to get everyone on the same page. If you disagree with me, just point out where you disagree. That's how we're going to make progress. The way we've been lied to and manipulated for so long here in America, in these politics where they keep telling us every single election, it's only these two choices. You can only choose between these two choices is only a lack of memory. And that's why it's getting more and more frustrating, because emotional manipulation requires a constant erasing of memory, erasing of the past bad deeds. So that way the oppressor, the terrorizer, the perpetuator of injustice, the person who is doing the harm, a violator, whatever you want to call them, they keep erasing the record, keep saying, trust me one more time. There's a lot of patterns of abuse between our political parties and emotional manipulation of a book. The best book I read recently about it is about con artists. George Bush, Barack Obama, these political leaders fit the pattern of a con artist. If you just watch what they do, there's a little bit of truth in what they say and what they do, and then they use that to manipulate. When you catch a con artist, you catch a liar, you catch a person who is trying to manipulate you just by recording what they say over time. It's very simple. The truth is revealed over time. And that's what we are doing. We are revealing truth over time. So, my name is Shaz. SHAZZBARBARIC. Shaz SB Barrick. Boom. Someone told me yesterday, they said, I can't really see your board. It's okay. I'm going to read it for you anyways. We'll get better lighting. We'll get better equipment. Another friend of mine, she says, it looks like I am in a hostage situation. Probably the harsh lighting. I don't think it looks that bad. So I'm in an office that I share with other people out of the kindness of their heart. So it's just harsh overhead lighting. I have my flag. I have a backdrop. So that way, a black backdrop's better than, a bunch of boxes and office stuff. Shaz, I'm running for the 20th Congressional District. This is for 2022. Started this November 1st, about a year out before my campaign. The ways that you can help, tell people. It doesn't cost you anything to text people, say, this is a weird guy. He's doing a weird thing. You just might succeed. He might not. He might fail miserably. One of my friends was like, you should do this. You should do that. I was like, well, yeah, if we succeed, if we fail, it'll be a good story. Let's at least start a new conversation. Spread the word. Grow that conversation. Number dos. You can give me money. My Venmo is SHAZZBAR at SHAZZBAR. SHAZZBAR. You can give me money if you want. If you give me $1, maybe I'll give you a sticker, depending on the budget. If you give me $5, I will definitely give you a sticker. Maybe something else. If you really want to help me, number 3, reserve my books, tenbonepress.com, TENBONEPRESS.com. There's 2 books I'm selling right now. out of the catalog I've written. I've written a couple books. I've started a lot, only finished a couple. 2 of those couple were in the last couple of years about Tao Te Shaz. I rewrote the Tao in haiku form, added some pictures. TaoTeshazz.com, TaoTeshazz.com. And Good Barracks, GOODBARICS.com. Those websites should be functional somewhat. In the links below, you have Shaz Saves the World on Instagram, at Shaz Saves the World, and you have at 10 Bone Press. 10 Bone Press has all of my writing since high school. I started in earnest a couple of years ago when I went on this journey. How do you save the world? And first, I looked inwards, calmed my soul, turned to some Zen Buddhism to make sure that along this journey, we're not replicating the problems I saw about 10 years ago when I protested with Occupy Wall Street. A little mini Occupy Wall Street documentary is also on there to show you a little bit of my role during that organization time period. I was in New York. I got arrested. I helped those crazy kids. Me as a crazy kid too. What was I, 29 at the time, 30, 29. We got in the street. It was an global anti-corporatist movement. Not mentioned once in Barack Obama's autobiography. Interesting. Let's see if he mentions us in the second part. That was one of the scariest things as an adult, is to realize that they're actually going to write us out of history. That you belong to something that was so emotionally charged. And we thought I would cry at the time. A lot of people would. We met each other there. We laughed, we cried, we bonded. Some of my best memories of my life. The only other place that I met people and had such a fast connection, a brotherhood, sisterhood, familyhood, was the Army. When you're in the military, life or death, existential situations, and you just make friends quick. And when you bond, you bond. And yeah, some of my Army buddies are still my buddies because those types of friendships are family. You trust people in a certain way when you're in the military. And in that protest group, when we got rolled on by the NYPD, I got beat up by 6 cops, my chain torn off of me, my belt torn off of me, held down, kicked in the head, punched in the head. It's like, I experienced that firsthand. They didn't say, "Are you black, you're brown, blah, blah, blah." No, that was unleashed by the federal government, directed by Barack Obama, coordinated through fusion centers. We don't talk about that. And that's one of the scariest things as an adult, to realize that your history that you lived through might be erased from the public record. Wow. Luckily, Shaz, he hired someone to record some of it, and it's on my Instagram. It's all on there. I realized going back over my life that first and foremost, I am a documentarian historian. I would like to be an artist. I would like to be a politician, but first and foremost over my life, I kept somewhat of a record, and now we are trying to use that record to do something new in politics. Let us record the record of others first, though. See, I could talk all day about myself, but that's not what this is about right now. First, this is about establishing what are we establishing? A process of review. We are establishing a system, a standard of accountability and honesty. So this is Reading the Times for Friday, October 29th. Reading the Times for Friday, October 29th. You know what? Like I told you, this isn't my studio. This is a shared space donated to me. So we could only do one today. But it's okay because we're going to catch up by the weekend is the goal. But today we only have one day. It's okay too because I'm a little sleep deprived. So here we go. A social policy framework fails to secure a Biden victory. The president joined House Democrats in the Capitol on Thursday morning, hoping that by personally detailing his framework and projecting confidence about a compromise, he could paper over outstanding disputes about what should be in the plan. "We have a framework that will get 50 votes in the United States Senate," Mr. Biden privately told House Democrats, according to a person familiar with his remarks. In public remarks at the White House, Mr. Biden praised the plan as historic. "No one got everything they wanted. including me, he said in the East Room before departing for Roma. House Democrats released 1,684 pages of what they said was the legislative text of the Build Back Better Act. But Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, his last name is Whitehouse, Democrat of Rhode Island, told reporters that the majority leader, Chuck Schumer of New York, had given senators another week to fight for provisions left out of the framework. Dun, dun, dun. Oh, you know what? I just messed that up. Fight for provisions left out of the framework. After months of productive, good faith negotiations with President Biden and the White House, we have made significant progress on the proposed budget reconciliation package. Ms. Sinema said in a statement. Liberal members of the House and the Senate had plenty to celebrate in the president's framework, even after the initial 10-year, $3.5 trillion blueprint was pared down to a package slightly more than half that size. Climate change became the largest part of the Biden spending bill. Climate has emerged as the single largest category in President Biden's new framework for a huge spending bill, placing global warming at the center of his party's domestic agenda in a way that was hard to imagine just a few years ago. In the remarks Thursday, Mr. Biden called it the most significant investment to deal with the climate crisis that ever happened beyond any other advanced nation in the world. The centerpiece of the climate spending is $300 billion in tax incentives for producers and purchasers of wind, solar, and nuclear power, inducements intended to speed up a transition away from oil, gas, and coal. In Congress, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer instructed committees to draft climate change legislation that would meet Mr. Biden's targets to cut emissions. Mr. Biden has been under growing pressure to demonstrate that the United States as a country that has fueled climate change by emitting the most greenhouse gases is taking action when he appears Monday at a pivotal United Nations summit on climate. Today, we have every major agricultural group and food company and researchers supporting a climate bill. What I'm hearing now from farmers is yes, you're absolutely right. The climate crisis is real, but we need help on what to do about it. Like many in her party, Ms. Stabenow attributes the new urgency in climate politics to the rise of extreme and deadly weather. As climate policies were crafted, Mr. Schumer's staff ran them through the program to determine how many tons of greenhouse gases they would eliminate. And as climate policies were dropped, they used the software to quickly identify replacement programs that would achieve similar levels of emission cuts. So I guess my big argument is going to be that we should be talking about war first, climate second. And it might be that climate is a distraction. Not that I don't think it's important, but we look at where we spend the money and look at I just want an honest, open, accountable discussion. That's all. We're not going to present any hypotheses yet. No analysis, just reading, Shaz. Andrew Cuomo is charged in sexual misconduct complaint. The evidence against Mr. Cuomo, the complaint said, includes a text message from his cell phone, state police BlackBerry PIN messages, state police aviation records for December 7th, and swipe card entry records from the state capitol. Ms. Comiso filed a complaint against Mr. Cuomo with the Albany County Sheriff's Office in August. The criminal complaint said Mr. Cuomo did intentionally and for no legitimate purpose forcibly place his hand under the blouse skirt of the victim and onto her intimate body part. Ms. Comiso did not respond to a call or text, and lawyer representing her cannot immediately be reached for comment. Mr. Cuomo, as well as his aides, repeatedly attacked the 165-page report as politically motivated and driven by Ms. James' interest in running for governor, even though Mr. Cuomo originally authorized and supported the investigation. The Attorney General's report said that Ms. Comiso told investigators that Ms. Comiso was the initiator of any hugs between them and that he went along with the hugs because he did not want to make anyone feel awkward about anything. Ms. Comiso responded by telling CBS This Morning in August that she thought Mr. Cuomo was lying, adding that I would never on my own get up and initiate a hug with the governor. What he did to me was a crime. Ms. Camaso said in the interview. Biden implores Democrats to support his transformative agenda. The bickering among Democrats would fade, one senior official said, when Americans started seeing the benefits of Mr. Biden's plan, like when the administration breaks ground next year on new electrical vehicle charging stations. White House officials concluded that it was time for Mr. Biden to put down his final marker, explicitly asking Democratic lawmakers for their support on a specific proposal. In the meantime, Mr. Biden is left without a concrete plan that has the support of Congress to present at the G20 gathering or the climate change summit next week. Mr. Biden first had to negotiate with Republicans on an infrastructure bill, largely to unlock support from Senate centrists on a larger spending bill that was meant to carry the portions of his agenda that could not win bipartisan support. Mr. Biden pushed centrists to come up from their original demands that the bill cost 1.5 trillion or less. The Mr. Biden started Thursday by unveiling what White House officials said was a detailed outline for the spending bill, telling reporters that the administration was confident that the historic framework will earn the support of every Democratic senator and pass the House. Even as the president pitched the plan to lawmakers, his chief of staff was hailing it as a transformational, and interest groups were congratulating Mr. Biden. Keep or replace the fate of Minneapolis police is in voters' hands. Days after a police officer murdered George Floyd, protesters gathered outside Mayor Jacob Frey's home, demanding that the Minneapolis Police Department be abolished. The crowd responded with jeers of shame. On Tuesday, nearly a year and a half since Mr. Floyd's death thrust Minneapolis into the center of a fervent debate over how to prevent public abuse or police abuse. Voters in the city will have a choice. Should the Minneapolis Police Department be replaced with a Department of Public Safety? And should Mr. Frey, who led the city when Mr. Floyd was killed and parts of Minneapolis burned, keep his job? Minneapolis became a symbol of all that was wrong with American policing, and voters now have the option to move further than any other large city in rethinking what law enforcement should look like. In the days after Mr. Floyd's death, as protests erupted across the country, Minneapolis became the center of a push among progressive activists to defund or abolish the police. If the ballot measure passes next week, there would soon be no Minneapolis Police Department. Worries about crime are also shaping much of the conversation, and even as Minneapolis voters weigh replacing the department, city officials have proposed increasing the police budget by 27.6 million or 17%, essentially restoring earlier cuts. We need more police. For his part, the police chief, Maderia Arradondo, has urged voters to reject the amendment, saying it fails to provide a clear sense of what public safety would really look like if the police department were to vanish. I try to drink that coffee before it gets cold, right? To save a swirling season, Atlanta turned to soft serve. Atlanta's game changer in 2021, a soft serve ice cream machine. Why hasn't Manasian, they needled, sourced them a soft serve ice cream machine? Manasian knew he couldn't order such a device without permission. A few days later, Freeman texted Anthopoulos to tell him they were now 3-1 with the ice cream. If you told me I had to spend my own money to buy an ice cream machine to win the NL East, I would do it. Anthopoulos said, everyone has enjoyed the ice cream, even Anthopoulos and his son, and of course, Freeman. Just go in there and get your ice cream and you're a kid again. The legend of the machine grew as the team turned its season around. That's the front page of the New York Times. As we continue our scramble for Africa, colonizing a whole continent, as there is a homeless crisis. I was homeless for a little bit. I care much about that, as there still is an opiate epidemic. In Japan, rural voters count more than those in big cities, it shows. In Japan, rural votes count for more than urban ones, giving less populated areas like Shizu a disproportionately large number of seats in parliament and more chances to register their concerns with national politicians. Critics say such disparities, which are common in rural communities, are fundamentally at odds with the democratic principle of one person, one vote, and have skewed Japan's politics and domestic priorities. Beside producing high agricultural subsidies, more hospital beds, or smaller class sizes in rural constituencies, the voting system can nudge political debates toward policies opposed by the majority. If the voter malapportionment is solved, Mr. Horiuchi said, urban voices will be heard. Advocates for rural areas say that if representation were allocated strictly by population, Japan's remote areas might deteriorate further, an argument that some political scientists agree has merit. Yuta Murakami, 36, an accountant for a cosmetic distributor, said he was aware of the differences between urban and rural districts, but that he was more concerned about low voter turnout in Tokyo. In the last election for the lower house of parliament in 2017, less than half of registered voters in the Adachi district voted. America is back, Biden declared in June. The world is about to test him. It's all about leading the world. We're letting the world pass us by. Mr. Biden, who often refers to his skill as a negotiator and his decades of foreign policy experience, will seek commitments from foreign leaders to combat the pandemic, untangle supply chain knots, and slow a rush of inflation around the world. Giving the French priority is a signal that Mr. Biden is trying to assuage them after the United States reached an agreement to provide Australia with nuclear submarines, effectively cutting France out of its own multi-billion-dollar submarine deal with Australia. Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, discounted the idea that Mr. Biden would have less of a leadership role at the two summits if he traveled to Europe without a signed economic and environmental spending deal or passage of the major infrastructure spending bill in Congress. On Saturday, Mr. Biden's first meeting of the summit will be focused on economic policy and the pandemic. Many will meet with leaders of France, Germany, and Britain to discuss ways to get the 2015 nuclear accord with Iran back on track, one of Mr. Biden's most elusive diplomatic goals since assuming the presidency. Celia Belin, a visiting fellow in the Center of the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institute, said in an interview that Biden administration seemed to forget the tasteful art of diplomacy. Since the blow-up, Mr. Macron has spoken openly about the need for European nations to practice so-called strategic autonomy, a policy that would gradually mean countries like France would rely less on the United States for military assistance. Mr. Biden is also expected to address at least one more rocky diplomatic relationship while abroad. In recent days, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey has threatened to recall its ambassador to the United States after several embassies, including America's, called for the release of an imprisoned activist. Okay, our coffee is done. It went down the wrong hole. Okay. Saudi finance official is missing from conference he hosts. Yasser al-Rumayyan, the Saudi official who oversees the kingdom's $450 billion sovereign wealth fund, was missing from the annual investment conference he typically presides over. The organizers of the event, the Future Investment Initiative, referred questions about Mr. al-Rumayyan's absence to the Saudi government. Kevin Foster, the Public Investment Fund's global head of communications, did not respond to a request for comment. Mr. al-Rumayyan, who is the public face of the kingdom's increasingly global network of investments, has had a particularly busy travel schedule lately. 2 days later, he shook hands with Queen Elizabeth at the Global Investment Summit at Windsor Castle, an event meant to emphasize green technology and finance investment opportunities in Britain. Despite his absence, the investment summit, which ended Thursday, has run smoothly. Meeting of Francis and Biden will highlight rift with U.S. bishops. President Donald J. Trump, whose Christianity Francis once questioned for his anti-immigrant policies, ushered in a populist era that helped sideline Francis. The American Catholic television network, EWTN, is arguably the world's largest and its biggest star, Raymond Arroyo, that's the world's largest television network, a favorite of Mr. Trump, has frequently hosted guests hostile to Francis and Mr. Biden. On his recent trip to Slovakia, Francis also joked in a meeting with Jesuits who asked about his health that he was still alive, even though some people wanted me to die. He also pointed out a large Catholic television channel that has no hesitation in continually speaking ill of the Pope. Spicy. They are the work of the devil, the Pope added. Last week, a report in the National Catholic Reporter showed that columns and newsletters by the United States bishops had largely ignored Francis' call for action against climate change. The bishops are sending an unambiguous message, said Massimo Fagioli, a Villanova University theology professor and author of Joe Biden and the Catholicism in the United States. We don't care what Pope Francis says or does. Mr. Fagioli argued that Francis was trying to save American bishops from the self-destruction of politicization, but that they were ignoring him and viewed both Mr. Biden and the Pope as threats to their side of the culture wars over abortion and gay rights. As Vice President, Mr. Biden accompanied Francis on several stops during the Pope's trip to the United States in 2015. That's interesting. I did not know that. There is an overtaking of religion as a political consortium in the United States. Going back, Republicans have basically used Christianity as just a separate organizing faction. It was like, this is all well documented, but I didn't know that they got the Catholics in the United States. So the Catholics in the United States are siding more with the Republican agenda than they are with the leader of their religion. It's interesting, spicy. France and the United States seek an elusive reconciliation. Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French foreign minister, accused the United States of contempt and a unilateral, brutal, unpredictable decision. Officials said that they hope the American moves will put to rest the fight between the United States and France over the submarine deal with Australia, which withdrew from a contract with France to supply conventional submarines in favor of a deal worked out secretly with the United States and Britain. The United States is still our major ally, said General Thierry Bouchard, a French military chief of staff, in an interview with the New York Times. At the core of his vision lies what he calls European strategic autonomy. This, he argues, should leave European Union to something like a middle course between the two great powers of the 21st century, the United States and China, bound to America through values and long friendships, but engaging rather than confronting China. During a meeting in Athens last month, General Bouchard said he told his American counterpart, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that it was the interest of everyone to push the idea of a collective European defense. He said that French officials believe that support from the United States is crucial to getting other European countries on board. For France, whose fight against the Islamic State and Al Qaeda in Africa has become known as its forever war, any additional support from the United States will have an important conciliatory gesture. With Mr. Macron facing an election in April and nationalist anti-immigrant candidates commanding at least a third of the vote, according to the polls, French officials argue that a strong show of American solidarity with France is important to the European stability in the United States seeks. I read a book called The Forever War. We could talk so much about each one of these articles. Be very wary of that term, the forever war. That is a code for empire. They have been calling our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq the forever wars because they're not really wars. They're territorial expansion. And once you take that territory, you have to forever defend it because you're basically stopping people from self-determination. And so France, America, and other imperial powers of 100 years ago are still scrambling for Africa. We just don't talk about it. That's one of the narratives we are ignoring. And that is actually the travesty of the modern age. So much to unpack. After time of real terror, city's resilience is symbolized in statue. Then the tour guide performs a neat trick that would make Ovid proud. She metamorphoses into a winged statue while a young girl looking on mouths, "Wow." And that young girl's name, Owen Wilson. Wow. Wow. The commercial seen on national TV encourages Italians to take the sights of Brescia, an industrious northern city midway between Milan and Verona, that is bypassed by most international visitors and whose considerable charms most Italians need reminding of too. This city is known for an ancient Roman sculpture that for nearly 200 years has been a symbol of Brescia's resilience in times of trouble. In 2020, Italy was the first country in Europe to have a major outbreak of the coronavirus, and cities in the Lombardy region, especially Brescia and Bergamo, its neighbor 20 miles to the west, became early warnings to the world of just how catastrophic the pandemic would be. City officials are trying to capitalize on those good feelings to promote a city better known for its industrial production, mostly machine tools and steel products, than as a cultural hub. The find revived local pride in Brescia's Roman heritage. While Brixia, as the city was known in ancient times, was a thriving place, and the winged victory was a gilded beacon seen from afar by travelers on the ancient Via Gallica probably, which linked some of the most important towns in northern Italy. In 1998, the statue was put on display in a city museum, but a restoration completed last year became the opportunity to reinstall the sculpture in the city's archaeological park to better showcase the piece. Looted treasures begin a long journey home from France. What is this, a French station? More than a century after French colonial troops ransacked a West African royal palace and took its treasures, President Emmanuel Macron of France on Wednesday began the formal transition of 26 of those artifacts to Benin in the first large scale act of restitution to Africa by a former European colonial power. It's not former. The president will complete the transfer in a signing ceremony with President Patrice Talon of Benin at the Élysée Palace, after which the treasures will permanently leave France. The 26 objects returning to Benin were plundered from a royal palace in 1892 when French forces invaded the country, then known as Dahomey, and made it a French colony for more than 6 decades. On arrival in Benin, the artifacts will initially be displayed in a museum compound in the city of Ouidah, where slaves were once traded by the Portuguese. The two museums are among the beneficiaries of 1 billion euros, around $1.16 billion, spent since 2016 on the nation's cultural infrastructure in an effort to turn Benin into a tourist destination. The country's foreign minister, Arayan Agbenonchi, said at the Paris ceremony. Mr. Mevek Hanin, who lives and works in France, said the people of Benin had been dismembered by the looting at Abomey because the artifacts taken were used on a daily basis in community rituals and ceremonies. What to know about the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse? Kyle Rittenhouse, an 18-year-old from Antioch, Illinois, will stand trial on November 1st for the shooting of 3 men, 2 of whom died in the aftermath of demonstrations in Kenosha, Wisconsin in August 2020. Mr. Rittenhouse has been closely following news of the shooting of Mr. Blake, which occurred when officers had arrived at an apartment in response to a domestic complaint and tried to arrest Mr. Blake, who is black. Part of my job is to protect people, Mr. Rittenhouse said on the evening of the fatal shootings in an interview with the Daily Caller. If someone is hurt, I'm running into harm's way. That's why I have my rifle. I've got to protect myself, obviously, but I also have my med kit. Kyle Rittenhouse, 18, is on trial for the killing of 2 people protesting the police shooting of a black man in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Here's what to know. I realized this yesterday when I was summarizing every day. I summarize the news as I try to catch up to the present. The New York Times does these, here's what to know, and then they have 5 or 6 slides where they summarize an event. They have one in this Kyle Rittenhouse trial that they're beating to death. I mean, they're just going to follow it. They're going to do like an OJ and have daily updates on that. They have one on the Taliban. Here's what to know about the Taliban, and a couple others. And they're just slides that they're going to insert into every article. So I'm going to stop inserting them into my summaries. But so every time I see a here's what to know, I know that I just copied it, and we're just going to leave it out of the next summary. Families, and what's interesting is what they leave out of the here's what to know. Here's what to know about the Taliban. The United States supported them for years. Families of Charleston massacre victims reach $88 million settlement. The lawsuits allege that the FBI's National Institute, the lawsuit alleged, no, the lawsuits plural. The lawsuits alleged that the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Systems, National Instant Criminal Background Check System failed to discover in a timely manner that the gunman, Dylan S. Roof, had been prohibited by federal law from possessing a firearm. The department statement said Mr. Roof, who was 21 at the time, had been allowed to buy the .45 caliber handgun he used in the killings because of a breakdown in the federal gun background check system. The FBI said on June 17, 2015, Mr. Roof entered the church's fellowship hall and was offered a seat for a Bible study. Weeks after the shooting, James B. Comey, the FBI director at the time, said Mr. Roof had exploited a 3-day waiting period that had allowed thousands of prohibited buyers to legally purchase firearms. According to Mr. Comey, the FBI, which operates the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, had received a call from a dealer in South Carolina seeking approval to sell a gun to Mr. Roof. Information about Mr. Roof's admission to having been in possession of a controlled substance had made its way into a database called the National Data Exchange, but it was not unearthed during the background check. Trauma of Charlottesville rally is soundtrack to start of civil trial. The plaintiffs, sitting behind the lawyers, faced 2 rows of defendants, white nationalists and neo-Nazis, and their lawyers across the courtroom. Roberta Kaplan, one of 2 lead lawyers for the plaintiffs, said they had waited 4 long years for the moment in the court. The events in Charlottesville further divided the nation after President Donald J. Trump said they were very fine people on both sides. For roughly the 2 hours of the trial, the plaintiffs' lawyers displayed graphic videos, chat postings, and emails meant to provide their contention that the organizers planned violence and then executed it. Who are the plaintiffs? The 9 plaintiffs include an ordained minister, a landscaper, and several students. Ms. Dunn, one of the plaintiffs' lawyers, expressed concern that harboring an extremely negative attitude toward Antifa might cloud a juror's ability to be impartial if the defendants falsely accuse the plaintiffs of being adherents. Judge Moon repeatedly interrupted the defense lawyers to admonish them to stick to the issues of whether the plaintiffs are due compensation instead of wandering into other subjects. After Supreme Court lifts stay, Oklahoma executes inmate. Supreme Court on Thursday lifted a stay of execution that a federal appeals court had granted to 2 Oklahoma death row inmates, clearing the way for men to be put to death by lethal injection. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections said the execution was carried out in accordance with protocols and without complication. Mr. Grant and the other inmate, Julius Jones, had argued that the state's lethal injection protocol, which uses 3 chemicals, could subject them to excruciating pain. The Supreme Court has been skeptical of challenges to lethal injection protocols and requires inmates to demonstrate that they would be subjected to a substantial risk of severe pain. Inmates challenging a protocol must also propose an alternative. A divided 3-judge panel of the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit granted a stay of execution to Mr. Grant and Mr. Jones, saying they were not required to check a box choosing how they would die. We find nothing in the relevant case law that specifically requires a prisoner to designate a method of execution to be used in his case by checking box, when the prisoner has already identified in his complaint the very same alternative methods given as choices on the form. The majority wrote in an unsigned order. In dissent, Judge Timothy M. Timkovich wrote that inmates must do more than propose a conditional hypothetical, or abstract designation. An inmate must, he wrote, designate an alternative method that can be used in his case. Calling an appeals court decision a grievous error, John M. O'Connor, Oklahoma's Attorney General, filed an emergency application asking the Supreme Court to lift the stay. You get to decide the alternative of your execution if you don't want the lethal injection. That's interesting. Producers of Alec Baldwin film scrutinized after shooting. Producers who don't want the bond. The producers who don't want to bond are only doing so to save money, said Randy Greenberg, a producer, film finance consultant, and former studio executive. Last week, the producer said in a statement that they were fully cooperating with all investigations and inquiries. The authorities in New Mexico, where Rust was filming last week, are still trying to figure out what went wrong. As investigators in New Mexico piece together what happened on the Rust set, the producers of the film are coming under increased scrutiny. Mr. Smith had multiple executive producer credits, which indicated financial involvement, including one for the trial of the Chicago 7. But Rust was only his second scripted feature as a full producer, according to IMDb Pro, an entertainment industry database. Two more producers, Nathan Klinger and Ryan Winterston, who have a company called Short Porch Pictures, have no previous credits as full producers. The fifth producer on the set was Angel Negham, who helped Mr. Baldwin produce Crown Vic. Mr. Negham has spent his career primarily as an actor, appearing intermittently as Dr. Raj on Grey's Anatomy from 2005 to 2017. Why co-working spaces are betting on the suburbs. New York City metropolitan area, home of the country's largest office districts, co-working spaces are increasingly targeting the hundreds of thousands of office workers who live in the suburbs. Some developers who own Manhattan's office buildings have scoffed at the idea that satellite workplaces will become a permanent alternative to working from home or from traditional offices, believing that the hybrid model is a short-term trend. At the heart of Daybase's thesis is the idea that giving employees the flexibility to work from suburban office space will ultimately attract a wider talent pool and make New York City more competitive with other cities. Despite a recent uptick in demand for Manhattan office leases, the availability of office space there is still near a record high. There are signs that the commercial market is picking up the pace of leasing, and in terms of how many tenants are out there looking for space. In the New York region, about 32% of workers in the office Okay. In the New York region, about 32% of workers were in the office in mid-October, according to Castle Systems, a security company that tracks employee card swipes in office buildings. A bigger reckoning around office space may unfold in the coming years, as an estimated 30% of leases at large Manhattan buildings will expire by 2024, according to the New York State Comptroller's Office. Here's what's in Biden's $1.85 trillion plan. $555 billion to fight climate change, largely through tax incentives for low-emission sources of energy. $200 billion to extend an expanded tax credit for parents through 2022, and to permanently allow parents to benefit from the child tax credit, even if they do not earn enough money to have income tax liability. So half of it is so far is just tax credits. $40 billion for worker training and higher education, including increasing annual Pell Grants by $550. Offsetting that spending is an estimated $2 trillion in revenue increases, including a 15% minimum tax on reported profits of large corporations. Efforts to reduce profit shifting by multinational companies, including a separate 15% minimum tax on profits earned by U.S. companies abroad, and tax penalties for companies that have their headquarters in global tax havens. an additional 5% tax on incomes exceeding 10 million a year, and another 3% tax on incomes above 25 million. Efforts to limit business losses for the very wealthy and to impose a 3.8% Medicare tax on certain people earning more than $400,000 a year who did not previously pay the tax. How Biden's $2 trillion in tax increases target companies and the rich. Ultimately, the package of tax increases mostly turns up the dial on more conventional tax policies, while adding some new wrinkles to curb maneuvers that allow tax avoidance. Here's a look at what the new tax plan. Here's a look at what's new in the new tax plan. Instead of a wealth tax or a special tax on billionaires, Mr. Biden rolled out a new surtax on income for multimillionaires and billionaires. The Biden administration estimates that these tax increases would hit the top 0.02% of taxpayers and raise $230 billion of tax revenue over a decade. Borrowing a page from his campaign playbook, Mr. Biden wants to impose a 15% minimum tax on profitable companies that have little to no federal tax liability. The new tax would apply to companies with more than $1 billion in so-called book income, profits that firms report to the shareholders, but not to the IRS. The plan is meant to ensure that the approximately 200 companies that pay no corporate income tax will have to pay some money to the federal government. Chai Ching Huang, the executive director of the Tax Law Center at New York University, said on Thursday that the proposal could mean that financial statements where book income is reported could become the new locus for tax avoidance. A separate proposal would also enact a 1% surcharge on corporate stock buybacks. Oil executives grilled over industry's role in climate disinformation. I'll tell you what's frustrating is a member of Congress telling American oil and gas companies to reduce production, said Representative Jim Jordan, Republican of Ohio, adding that he felt those companies should instead be commended for increasing production. The hearing marked the first time oil executives were pressed publicly to answer questions under oath about whether their companies misled the public about the reality of climate change by obscuring the scientific consensus that the burning of fossil fuels is raising Earth's temperature and sea levels with devastating consequences worldwide, including intensifying storms, worsening drought, and deadlier wildfires. In another, Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat of California, asked the executives to tell the American Petroleum Institute and wait, Representative Ro Khanna, a Democrat of California, asked the executives to tell the American Petroleum Institute and other trade groups, which the companies pay to represent their interest in Washington, to stop funding advertisements against electric vehicles and other climate policies. Mr. Woods, the CEO of ExxonMobil, faced questions about the company's statements over the years that cast doubt on whether fossil fuels were the main driver of climate change. The group captured on video an Exxon lobbyist who said the company had fought climate science through shadow groups and targeted influential senators in an effort to weaken President Biden's climate proposals. Ms. Maloney said she intends to issue subpoenas to the companies to see whether they are spending to fund campaigns that fight climate policy, and if so, how much. Family members separated at border may each get up to $450,000. Families separated at the border by the Trump administration may be eligible to receive each hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation for the damage inflicted on them by the policy, according to several people familiar with the matter. There's no question that the Biden administration is doing the right thing by providing meaningful monetary compensation, given that the U.S. government deliberately brutalized these families, including babies and toddlers, said Lee Gillern, a lead negotiator on behalf of the families and deputy director of the American Civil Liberties Union Immigrant Rights Project. In parallel negotiations, the ACLU is trying to reach a settlement with the government that would provide, among other things, a pathway to remain in the United States and social services for the families. In February, his administration formed a task force with representatives of the Department of Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, and state to reunite migrant families that remain separated and determine how to make amends for the harm caused by the policy. Following a federal court order last year, Seneca Family of Agencies, a social services provider, has been coordinating counseling for parents and children reunified in the United States. What we have seen is that families desperately need mental health services and are eagerly receiving them, said Mark Rosenbaum, the lead counsel in the case, who sought the services of the families. Think of, anyways, that one hits the emotions that the United States, these people are coming here for a better life. They're refugees, economic refugees, often from wars of our own creation, the civil wars we created in Latin America that's documented. And then they come to the border and we take away their kids. Some of them can't be reunited. They can't find their kids. Like, family is really important. Imagine you come here fleeing, looking for a new life, and your children are taken away from you forever. You never find your kids again, toddlers, babies. They say they can't. Some of these families, they don't know what happened to their children. The contentious issue that's boosting a Republican on Long Island. The special election next Tuesday has become increasingly competitive, largely because Mr. Kaminsky's Republican opponent, Ann Donnelly, has effectively framed the contest as a suburban referendum on the state's recent laws to loosen bail restrictions. Jay Jacobs, the chairman of the New York State Democratic Party, said Miss Donnelly was a substandard candidate who had distorted the damage done by changes in bail laws and who mischaracterized Mr. Kaminsky's record on the issue. Bail reform is also playing a notable role in neighboring Suffolk County, where Timothy Sini, the Democratic district attorney, and Ray Tierney, the Republican challenger, have both criticized the changes to state law, saying they endanger public safety. The law created significant backlash after law enforcement officials raised the specter of dangerous criminals on the loose. At the same time, Republicans spent millions of dollars attacking Democrats for supporting the original law, as well as to the defund the police movement, running ads that were meant to stoke fears over the supposed harm to public safety from the law. Now the district attorney race has catapulted the bail law and Mr. Kaminsky's involvement in it to the forefront for a second year in a row. Hochul acts to open up a government long defined by backroom deals. Governor Kathy Hochul, under pressure from government watchdog groups on Thursday, released details of a plan to recuse herself from all matters involving Delaware North, the casino and concessions company, where her husband is a top executive. The move came as a part of a broader initiative by Ms. Hochul that includes plans to improve accountability across state agencies and to reduce a backlog of public record requests. Ms. Hochul, who became governor in August after her predecessor, Andrew M. Cuomo, resigned amid several scandals, said she hoped to restore the public's faith in government. Her husband, William Hochul, is a senior vice president and the general counsel at Delaware North, a company based in Buffalo that has numerous government contracts. The recusal plan are special to Ms. Hochul and her top aides and do not apply to state workers more broadly. Watchdog groups hailed the initiatives and the transparent way in which Ms. Hochul presented them as a major step toward building public trust. So the replacement for Andrew Cuomo resigns because he likes to inappropriately touch people, documented. Apparently this is a pattern. Someone else who likes to do that is Joe Biden, right? But we won't talk about that. And then her husband, the replacement for Mr. Cuomo, is a senior vice president of a company that has numerous government contracts. So everywhere you look in American democracy, you find people just profiting from it. Jumaine Williams runs for one office with an eye for another. Mr. Williams has formed an exploratory committee to run for governor next year in what is expected to be a crowded, competitive Democratic primary field. Mr. Williams enjoys some statewide voter recognition. In 2018, he lost to Ms. Hochul in a Democratic primary for a lieutenant governor by almost 7 percentage points, but did better than expected. He outpaced Ms. Hochul in New York City by 60,000 votes, racking up big totals in Manhattan and Brooklyn, the county with most registered Democrats in the state. Mr. Williams said he was considering running for governor because of power to make groundbreaking changes to affordable housing and criminal justice, two issues he had focused on most during his political career, resides in the governor's office. Mr. Landor said he sees many similarities between Miss Walton's race and a potential primary run for governor by Mr. Williams. Even if Mr. Williams were to run and lose in a Democratic primary for governor, a good showing could position him to be a leading far left voice for New York, a local complement to Representative Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, also a Democratic socialist, said Christina Greer, a political scientist at Fordham University. In his unsuccessful run for lieutenant governor, Mr. Williams positioned himself as a check on Mr. Cuomo's leadership. We knew Bolsonaro was guilty. Now we have 1,288 pages of proof. We have Jair Bolsonaro, a man who maintains that the primary victims of COVID-19 have been the obese and those who became frightened. It was about time someone documented Mr. Bolsonaro's catastrophic stewardship of the country through the pandemic, and the 1,288-page report does just that. Probably no more. It's unlikely Mr. Bolsonaro, protected by a friendly prosecutor general, will ever face the charges levied against him. The report certainly won't rein in Mr. Bolsonaro's behavior, the vote effectively accusing a sitting president of crimes against humanity amounts to a remarkable condemnation of Mr. Bolsonaro. The report also recommends indicting 2 companies and 77 other people, including Mr. Bolsonaro's 3 eldest sons, 2 of his aides, the current health minister, a handful of other ministers, a few congressmen, the former secretary of social communications, the president of the Brazilian Federal Council of Medicine, and the owners and the CEO of Prevent Senior. While the document is certainly something to celebrate, it's sadly not enough to make Mr. Bolsonaro and his allies answer for their actions. Should we have such a report against Donald Trump? For everything that, don't comment, Shaz, just read. We are going to comment once we're done with today's Friday of last week. And then we're going to go through the whole week, look at the narratives, look at what they talked about, look at what maybe they should talk about based on objective reality, or based on facts grounded in objective reality. And then we're going to present new narratives which will actually address our issues. That's the goal here, little by little. I'm just thinking while I read this. The self-isolation of the American left. Modern progressivism is in danger of becoming dominated by a relatively small group of people who went to the same colleges, live in the same neighborhoods, and have trouble seeing beyond their subculture's point of view. I just basically said that. 73% of American adults believe race or ethnicity should not be a factor in college admissions decisions, including 62% of Black adults, according to a 2019 Pew survey. American educators have been gradually finding ways to teach American history that both honor the nation's achievements and detail the horrors of slavery, Jim Crow, and systemic racism. On behalf of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, Jeremy Stern reviewed the 50 state history standards in 2011 and then again in 2021. In my experience, most teachers find ways to teach American history in this way, and most parents support it. 78% of Americans support teaching high schoolers about slavery, according to a 2021 Reuters Ipsos poll. Their core intuition is not crazy. One subculture is sometimes using its cultural power to try to make its views dominant, often through intimidation. Oh, that's our friend David Brooks. David Brooks. We know a lot about him. We're going to get into him in the future. Cowards, not crazies, are destroying America. On the contrary, it was a recapitulation of the journey the whole Republican Party has taken on issue after issue, from tax cuts to the big lie about the 2020 election. The crazies wouldn't be driving the Republican agenda so completely if it weren't for the cowards, Republicans who clearly know better but reliably swallow their misgivings and go along with the party line. In 1980, George H.W. Bush, running against Ronald Reagan for the Republican presidential nomination, called the assertion voodoo economic policy. Everything we've seen since then says that he was right. Donald Trump never made any evidence on his side. Donald Trump never had any evidence on his side, but he didn't care. He just wanted to hold power, or, failing to do that, promulgate the lie that would help him retain his hold on the GOP. Despite the lack of evidence, and the failure of every attempt to produce or create a case, a steady drumbeat of propaganda has persuaded an overwhelming majority of Republicans that Joe Biden's victory was illegitimate. Establishment Republicans, who at first pushed back against the big lie, have gone quiet or even begun to promote the falsehood. Many Republican voters appear to have turned against longstanding requirements that parents have their children vaccinated against other contagious diseases. When the world is on the brink, $3.5 trillion is a pittance. As President Biden takes an unfinished plan for as President Biden takes an unfinished plan for U.S. emissions cuts to a global climate conference in Glasgow next week, Congress and the country remain hung up on what that agenda, wrapped in the Build Back Better Act, might cost. 4% is likely a conservative estimate. It leaves out consequential costs like damages from drought and climate migration. In more than 3 decades since Congress held its first major hearing on global warming, the nation has spent $2 trillion sweeping up from disasters, many now believed to have been made worse by climate change. What happens as these events become more frequent and more devastating? The fourth National Climate Assessment, released under the Trump administration in 2018, lists the sort of costs that Americans will see by late in the century as a scenario where emissions are allowed to continue to grow. The National Climate Assessment estimates that limiting warming to around 2 degrees Celsius will reduce economic harm, in many cases, by 30% to 60%. Among the bill's lesser known provisions in the last publicly released version of the bill were funding to survey forests and to hire people to fight wildfires, to provide agricultural research for farmers whose crops won't grow in hotter climate, to help homeowners transition from gas appliances to low emission technologies, and to study health risks linked to climate change. Why the Virginia election is freaking Democrats out. None of which is great news for the Democratic Party, which is confronting multiple warning signs that its voters are not all that fired up about the Virginia race or about politics in general. Only 35% of voters 18 to 29 years old said they were very motivated to vote next year, and just 28% said they were certain to vote. If Democrats lose their sense of urgency when it comes to voting, the party is in serious trouble. Democrats try to mobilize their voters with promises to enact popular policies: paid family leave, expanded Medicare coverage, cheaper prescription drugs, universal pre-K, and so on. Democratic voters were desperate to send Mr. Trump packing. So while the non-MAGA electorate might be rightly exhausted, Democrats should beware of letting their voters get comfy or complacent just because Mr. Trump is currently cooling his heels in Florida. The Climate Summit in Glasgow. Let's choose life. Success in Glasgow will not look like anything from past climate summits if Congress would pass Mr. Biden's Build Back Better legislation. That's a horrible name. if Congress, and his name is Biden too, so you have alliteration on 4 B words. If Congress would pass Mr. Biden's Build Back Better legislation with significant climate provisions included, it would help the president pressure other countries to follow suit and reduce their carbon dioxide pollution. With the climate conference just days away, it's time for President Biden to make an end run. Pleading with Congress to address climate change wastes time. Mr. Biden, our commander-in-chief, should direct the nation's grid's clean energy overhaul through the Defense Department, ordering a climate change moonshot. Let our defense investment be wielded to defend against the twin threat of grid hackers and climate upheaval. Facebook renamed itself Meta. The outcry reached a fever pitch after Frances Haugen, a former Facebook employee, leaked internal documents that showed how much of the company knew about the harmful effects it was causing. On Tuesday, Facebook told its employees to preserve internal documents and communication since 2016 that pertained to its business because the government and legislative bodies had started inquiries into its operations. The leak of internal documents by a former Facebook employee has provided an intimate look at the operations of the secretive social media company and renewed calls for better regulations of the company's wide reach. into the lives of its users. In September, the Wall Street Journal published the Facebook Files, a series of reports based on leaked documents. During an interview with 60 Minutes that aired on October 3rd, Frances Haugen, a Facebook product manager who left the company in May, revealed she was responsible for the leak of those internal documents. Documents from the Facebook papers show the degree to which Facebook knew of extremist groups on the site trying to polarize American voters before the election. Literally every day, there's one article, no, a couple articles about Facebook, always including those last couple sentences. And Facebook is a competitor to the New York Times as a news distributor. Coincidence? Who are America's billionaires, anyways? During the 2020 presidential campaign, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts floated an ultra-millionaire tax, and she and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders railed against both millionaires and billionaires in the negotiations over President Biden's infrastructure bill. Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat of Oregon and chairman of the Finance Committee, proposed the idea of a tax on billionaires specifically. There is an added hurdle that the idea of taxing billionaires presumes the Internal Revenue Service knows definitively who's in that category. Abigail Disney, the granddaughter of Roy Disney and a longtime critic of income inequality, said in an interview that she believes the immense displays of wealth by the country's richest during the pandemic, particularly the ostentatiousness of last summer's space race, helped foster a serious discussion about the tax burdens on billionaires. From the Pandora Papers to ProPublica's cache of tax documents to reports in the Times about President Donald J. Trump's $750 in taxes some years, the message is that the richest pay the least, Mr. Collins said. In comments denouncing the proposed billionaire tax, Mr. Manchin described the ultra-wealthy as people who create a lot of jobs and invest a lot of money and give a lot to philanthropic pursuits. That was an implicit endorsement of the idea, often repeated in discussions around high net worth giving, that regular people pay taxes while rich people pursue philanthropy, giving not to the treasury, but to their preferred causes. You know what? Let's just do a thought experiment real quick. If I was a dictator of the United States, you can say that I'm a philanthropist because a part of my dictatorship would be to give people money. But that's not how we're supposed to operate as a democracy, right? We're not supposed to allow vested interest to decide policy. So the if you have concentrated power, you're always going to have, as a form of that concentrated power, benevolence. Or else, if you oppress people too much, they revolt. So we have a form of benevolence from our billionaire overlords, but is it fair? No. When you look at their philanthropy, it's fractional at best, usually. China hurries to burn more coal, putting climate goals at risk. China's expanding mines to produce 220 million metric tons a year of extra coal, a nearly 6% rise from last year. China's National Mine Safety Administration said on October 21st that 10 accidents had left 18 workers dead in the preceding 4 weeks, mostly in coal mines. The closing of small mines and a national safety campaign have made coal mining much less dangerous. The small coal mines have been shut down, said Kui Ziping, a 68-year-old maintenance worker at the Longzi coal processing facility, which has been quiet for the last several years. The state-owned coal mines have standards. Coal shortages were not China's only electricity problem by September. The workers are digging black gold, said Liang Lijian, a coal washing worker at the Huipoli coal complex in Luijiayuan in southwestern Shaanxi. Rising prices and bottlenecks will last longer than expected, Christine Lagarde says. The jump in inflation has shifted market expectations about when the central bank might raise interest rates. Ms. Lagarde said the bank's analysis of the path of inflation did not support interest rate rises anytime soon. The central bank has previously stated it would not raise interest rates until it was clear that the annual inflation rate would reach 2%, well ahead of the end of the central bank's projection horizon, and stay around that level over the medium term. A final decision on when to end those purchases and whether the bank's older bond buying program will then be expanded to help meet the target of 2% inflation isn't expected until the central bank's December meeting, when policymakers will get a new set of forecasts for economic growth and inflation. The European Central Bank is likely to have a looser monetary stance with lower interest rates in place for longer than the policies of the Federal Reserve and Bank of England, because its longer term forecasts for inflation are still below the central bank's target. The bank's governor, Andrew Bailey, has said the rate of inflation was concerning and that officials need to prevent high inflation from becoming permanent. Amazon sales growth slows and costs rise. The company said sales in the 3 months ending in September hit $110.8 billion, up 15% from the same period a year earlier. The company is in the midst of what investment bank Cowen called a historic investment cycle. Cowen estimates that in 2020 and 2021, the company will have spent about $80 billion in logistics investments compared with about $58 billion in the previous 5 years combined. Brian Olsavsky, the company's finance chief, said the company had opened enough new buildings that for the first time since the start of the pandemic, it was no longer constrained by the amount of space it has to store items in its warehouse. Mr. Olsavsky said the additional pay to workers added $1 billion to the company's costs in the quarter, roughly half for wage hikes and half for incentives, such as an extra $3 an hour for undesirable shifts and signing bonuses as high as $3,000. Analysts expect the hiring and new warehouses to become a long-term advantage for Amazon because it will drive faster delivery times, which make customers buy more from the company. Its cloud computing businesses grew 39% to $16.1 billion as the pandemic accelerated how companies adopt new technologies to run their businesses. Third point, an activist investor is calling for a breakup of Royal Dutch Shell. As Royal Dutch Shell announced its quarterly earnings on Thursday, including a jump in profit that fell short of investors' expectations, company executives were dealing with an activist hedge fund's proposal that the oil giant be broken up. These companies could include a unit encompassing Shell's legacy oil and gas extraction business, and another with its renewable energy and liquefied natural gas activities. Third Point's chief executive, Daniel S. Loeb, said in a letter to investors. Mr. Loeb called Shell one of the cheapest large cap stocks in the world. He also said that by most metrics, Shell was trading at 35% discount to its rival ExxonMobil and Chevron, despite what he called higher quality and more sustainable business lines. Shell's chief financial officer, Jessica Uhl, said on a call with reporters Thursday that the company did not have much information about Third Point's intentions beyond the investor letter. Shell executives argue that a large, well capitalized organization with more than a century of experience delivering various forms of energy, Shell is well placed to make multi billion-dollar investments in areas like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen that will be needed in the shift to cleaner energies. Analysts at Bernstein, a research firm, wrote that they did not think a full split at Shell was imminent, but that the nudge from Third Point will get management back to the front foot, triggering their next shareholder-friendly step. In other words, Mr. Van Beurden and his colleagues, who have laid out one of the more detailed strategies for shifting to lower carbon businesses among the large oil companies, may be prompted to do more. Think about that. We have a company that's been around for over 100 years. Think about the events in the world which have happened over those 100 years and how they influence them. And then why is it their right to stay in power? Why is it we say, even as we transition away from hydrocarbons, we want to make sure these same players have the same concentration of power and wealth? Why? This is the game that's been playing since the beginning of time. People in power want to retain power. If we're evolving these technologies, shouldn't some of these old companies and old systems die? Or at least go extinct, be devolved? No. They want to claim the right over the new systems. It's like birthright. They claim because they've been around, they deserve to remain around. Clearview AI finally takes part in a federal accuracy test. Now, more than 2 years after law enforcement officers first started using the company's app, Clearview's algorithm, which allows it to match faces to photographs, have been put to a third party test for the first time. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, a unique federal agency that is also a scientific lab, administers its facial face recognition vendor test every few months. Oddly, Clearview submitted its algorithm for the former test rather than the latter one, which is what its product is built to do. NIST has been testing the accuracy of face recognition vendors since 2000, but participation is voluntary and testing isn't required for government agencies to buy the technology. Clearview AI has been sued in state and federal court in Illinois and in Vermont for collecting photos of people without their permission and subjecting them to facial recognition searches. The company will also come has also come under attack from fellow vendors, as reported by Insider, who worry that the controversy surrounding Clearview AI will cause problems for the facial recognition industry as a whole. In the Biden bill, the billionaires beat the working rich. So a CEO who makes $30 million would owe an additional 1.15 million dollars in federal income tax over current law. Earning $50 million in a single year would entail a considerably higher tax burden than the $10 million a year for 5 straight years. The owner of a company would continue to be able to accrue wealth as it became more valuable over time and would owe tax on gains only if they choose to sell shares. Most prominently, in recent days, Democrats were seriously considering what they branded a billionaire tax, which would have required Americans with $1 billion plus fortunes to pay capital gains tax on assets as their values rose, not just when those assets were sold. The billionaires tax would have affected some 700 families, whereas 22,000 tax returns in 2018 reported income over $10 million, the threshold at which the surtax would apply. The tax code favors investment income over wage income in a variety of ways. Most notably, the 20% tax rate on long-term capital gains that is far below the 37% top income tax rate. Geraldo Rivera criticizes his Fox News colleague, Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, the top rated Fox News host, faced criticism on Thursday, including from a prominent colleague at his own network, after he announced plans for a documentary series featuring debunked conspiracy theories about the Jan 6th riot at the United States Capitol. The three-part series, Patriot Purge, is set to be broadcast next month on Fox News' streaming service, Fox Nation. The trailer evoked a dismayed public response from Geraldo Rivera, the veteran Fox News correspondent, who used a profane term in a Twitter post to dismiss the claim that the Capitol riot was a false flag operation. The record to me is pretty damn clear that there was a riot that was incited and encouraged and unleashed by Donald Trump. Asked if he would urge Fox News bosses to reconsider airing Mr. Carlson's special, Mr. Rivera demurred, saying, "I don't want to go there. It's not my job." But he added of Mr. Carlson, "He's my colleague. He's my family. Sometimes you have to speak about your family." Fox News did not respond to a request for comment. In a Twitter post, she accused Fox News of giving Mr. Carlson a platform to spread the same type of lies that provoked violence on January 6th. Mr. Rivera, who is scheduled to appear on Thursday's episode of the Fox News afternoon program, The Five, recently renewed his contract with the network in a multi-year deal. In an announcement last month, Susan Scott, the chief executive of Fox News Media, described Mr. Rivera as an important voice of Fox News Channel over the last 2 decades, adding, "We are thrilled to have him continue to be a part of the Fox family." Fox News is not the only arm of Rupert Murdoch's media empire facing scrutiny this week. All right, and now we just have a couple coronavirus articles. Why China is the world's last Zero COVID holdout. The no holds bars response is emblematic of China's zero COVID policy, which has served the country remarkably well. China has reported fewer than 5,000 deaths since the pandemic began. The scale of the new outbreak, while tiny compared to many other countries, is large for China. China is now the only country still chasing full eradication of the virus. Xi Jinping, the China's leader, has repeatedly pointed to the country's success in containment as proof of the superiority of its governance model. China's strict lockdowns and mass testing campaigns, once criticized as heavy handed, became models for other countries. Gao Fu, the head of China's Center for Disease Control and Prevention, said in a recent interview with Chinese media that once a country reached an 85% vaccination rate, why shouldn't we open up? Until then, those stranded by the lockdowns have been trying to make the best of their situations. As the virus infected huge numbers of younger children, a startling statistic emerged as advisors to the Food and Drug Administration on Tuesday debated the use of the Pfizer BioNTech COVID 19 vaccine in children ages 5 to 11. Even if unexpectedly high numbers of children have been infected, parents should not assume that they are shielded from the virus and don't need the vaccine. The data are clear that even if they have been exposed in the past and they would benefit from the vaccine, he said. Speaking of children, it's unclear whether the protection seen in adults extends to children, in part because most of the children tend to have milder symptoms than adults and may not have mounted a full throttle defense against the virus. Is the vaccine safe? All the evidence so far indicates that vaccines are far safer than about a COVID, even for children. For children who have a history of heart disease or do not respond to the vaccine because of a certain medical condition, there may be another option. New York braces for a worker shortage as vaccination deadline nears. City officials are bracing for a possibility that thousands of essential workers, including police officers, firefighters, and sanitation employees, could be placed on unpaid leave starting Monday, when the city's sweeping mandate requiring that almost all municipal workers receive at least one dose of a coronavirus vaccine take effect. With just over one third of the workers in the fire and sanitation departments and one quarter of the police force yet to prove that they have been vaccinated as of Thursday morning, city agencies were putting in place an array of contingency plans, including mandating overtime for vaccinated workers and canceling vacations to fill staffing gaps. Mayor Bill de Blasio, Democrat in his second term, who issued the mandate, predicted on Thursday that many city workers will get the shot at the last minute, as happened just before similar mandates took effect in recent months for healthcare workers and school employees. New York is one of the first major American cities to require that its entire workforce receive the vaccination, without the option of getting regular coronavirus tests instead. San Francisco set a similar vaccine mandate for its 35,000 city workers, which goes into effect Monday. And Los Angeles and Chicago have been pushing public workers to get vaccinated. Requests for medical or religious exemptions for city workers were due on Wednesday, and employees who applied will be permitted to work if they undergo weekly testing while their cases are considered. Freddie Goldstein, a spokeswoman for District Council 37, the city's largest municipal labor union, said the union was trying to help its workers get religious and medical exemptions where appropriate. And for others, we want to make sure they maintain health insurance and, in some cases, can receive unemployment if they choose to fully separate from city service. All the holdout workers were also offered $500 as a bonus if they got vaccinated by the end of the workday Friday. U.S. recovery hurt by virus surge and supply chain troubles. The outcome for the rest of the year is mixed. The pandemic's grip is easing government aid, along with reduced spending during the pandemic, has left Americans flush with cash, which should support spending for the rest of the year, as long as retailers have goods to sell them. Understand the supply chain crisis. Oh, see, this is one of those. They have a set of cards that I have to stop copying. Understanding, but we'll read this one. Understanding the supply chain crisis. 1 of 5, and now that I probably so Anyways, I'll read it. COVID's impact on the supply chain continues. The pandemic has disrupted nearly every aspect of the global supply chain and made all kinds of products harder to find. Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve chair, said he expects supply chain problems to persist, likely well into next year. In 25 years of home service work and painting work, I've never seen anything like this, where you go into 25 years of home service work and painting work, I've never seen anything like this, where you go into a paint store, they're out of paint, said Dave Richley, the company's president. The snarled supply chain is partly a result of higher spending on goods during the pandemic, as Americans bought cars instead of plane tickets, workout equipment instead of gym memberships, and cooking equipment instead of restaurant meals. And that has been Reading the Times for Friday, October 29th, 2021. And then tomorrow we'll do a couple. What do we have to do? And then we have to do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of this week. So tomorrow we'll do, maybe we'll do that. We'll do 2 tomorrow. We'll do 2 on Saturday. And then on Sunday we'll do 1. And then we'll be up to the current day. And then Monday onwards of next week, we'll do 1 at a time. Then we have to brainstorm how to attract eyeballs to this. But it's okay. I'm practicing. You're practicing. If we begin a movement, we'll be practicing creating a better world. Thank you for your patience. Those who watch this, if there's anyone, we start small. This is the seed of change that hopefully we water with patience and support. This is SHAZZBARBARIC signing off. Here's for the revolution.